Hey, everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to the Hanging On to Hope podcast.
I'm Brenda J.
And I'm Karen Wonder.
And we are HangingOnToHope.org.
This podcast is intended as educational and is not psychological or medical advice. Always consult a professional when needed, and we disclaim any liability in connection with the instruction, information, or advice given. Hello, and welcome to the Hanging On to Hope podcast. This is Karen W. On today's podcast, we'll be talking about lament, something I've been wanting to talk about for a while. On today's podcast, we welcome Matt and Jackie LeFevers. They're the worship leaders at the Church The Well. They did a series about 4 months ago called Story and Song, Finding Ourselves in the Psalms. I love the series, and we will have a link to the series in our show notes. I think it's very relevant to talk about lament, since most of our listeners are survivors of abuse and have suffered much. Lament has a place in our culture, just like it did in ancient Israel. So welcome to the show, Matt and Jackie.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're happy to be here.
Yeah. I think this is such a relevant topic, like I said, and I'm hoping it will encourage our listeners. Can you share a little of what you do at the Well and what brought you to teach on this series?
Sure. I'm the worship and social media producer at the Well.
And I am one of the worship leaders.
And each of us has given a handful of sermons at the Well. We do it somewhat regularly, but in the past, it's always been one random Sunday in the middle of like a 6-week series. And this was the first time that the lead pastor, Ryan, approached me and was like, if you were going to conceptualize a series from scratch, like any topic you want, build out a 2-part series on it, what would you want to do it on? And we were drawn to talking about the Psalms. I think when I was first brainstorming, I just looked at my bookshelf and was like, what did we have the most books about? But we pretty quickly zeroed in on this idea of wanting to talk about the book of Psalms and specifically to spend a lot of time talking about the lament Psalms because they're a really big part of church culture. I think the Psalms are important to most churchgoers, but not everybody knows a lot about them once you dig into it under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think we've both been drawn to the Psalms because of the kind of the foundation of music. So we're both musicians and we're both songwriters. And so Psalms is a natural place to go when you're that type of creative spirit.
Yeah. Yeah. And they're just the Psalms to me that when I went through my divorce, because I was in a destructive relationship for 22 years and it left me so confused with the Bible. And so all I could read for a while was the Psalms because it just felt real. Like I could be real in the Psalms. Where some of the other verses and parts of the Bible, there was confusion because sometimes people have had scripture used against them too. And so the Psalms are a place that you just, I don't know, to me, I love the Psalms.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I definitely do too. Hi, this is Brenda J. So nice to meet both of you.
Likewise.
I do worship as well, just not in front of a church at this time, but like a lot of acoustic on my own. And I'll do the women's prayer group, but the Psalms definitely speak to me. You talk about in the series how the Psalms are not narrative stories, and sometimes the narrator talks to God and sometimes not. Jesus quotes the most from Psalms, so we can learn a lot just from that. You say that the Psalms are a collection of poems or songs with a unique perspective, that they were used in public worship in ancient Israel. Can you explain a little more about that?
Sure. One of the things I did when I was starting to research this is look into that fact about that people have collated what Jesus quotes from, which books he seems to come back to over and over, and that Psalms is like easily number one. And then there's a lot of other things like that where when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls and they totaled up how many copies of each book were there, like they also had the most copies of Psalms. So it seems like going back 2,000 years, this has always been a super important book. In some communities, maybe the most important book.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that continues even to today. In the sermon series, I put up a bunch of pictures of if you try to go buy just a copy of the New Testament, it'll be the New Testament and Psalms. They always stick them in there because no matter how much you're trying to shrink the Bible down, you have to keep Psalms.
Yeah, so important. I totally agree.
But the narrative format thing, I think that's one of the reasons Psalms are so unique and that so many people are drawn to them is that most of the books of the Bible are written in story form. You know, it's like characters going places, doing things. And Sometimes it will tell you what they're thinking. Usually it doesn't, and you just have to kind of imagine. But then the Psalms, you get this glimpse at the inner lives of the writers. It's very personal and vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah, and one thing I really find interesting is how varied the perspectives are. So, as Matt said, a lot of the stories and books in the Bibles, it is to a very specific audience. But when you're looking at the Psalms, if you hop from Psalm number 3 to Psalm number 17, it may be a conversation between the person who's praying and God, or it could be a person who's praying and they're speaking to their community. It's really interesting to try and consider who is the audience, because with each psalm, there's a very real possibility that it's going to be different from the previous audience.
Yeah.
And something I have realized as I've continued thinking about these is I think the book of Psalms, in a lot of ways, it's closer to how we relate to God, like now, because when you read Genesis and God is popping in to talk to people and having conversations with Abraham. And then in Exodus, he's talking to Moses. And like most of us haven't had that encounter where
most of us haven't had that.
I have not. I don't want to speak for everybody, but the one-on-one, like verbal encounter with God feels very foreign to us. But the way the psalmists relate to God, where it's offering these prayers of, praise or lament or whatever they are, but just kind of offering them up and not knowing if you're going to get a response. That's how faith feels to me, at least.
Yeah. And I was talking to a friend today and I was telling him about lamenting, and they're like, well, what is that? And I said, well, it's being real with God. It's really what a lot of the Psalms are, because to me, I have a problem in a lot of Christian music and even some worship sometimes where it feels very sugar coated. And to me, the Psalms and lamenting is more where you can just be real. Like, God, why are you hiding your face from me?
Yeah.
That type of thing. I mean, we all feel that way sometimes. But then the nice thing about the Psalm too is it always comes back to praise, and comes back to where you have faith, but sometimes, things are hard and you just need to verbalize that.
I didn't realize I was lamenting all the time.
Well, you talking about being, lamenting, it's extreme vulnerability.
Yeah.
And most people think of vulnerability as, they might think of lamenting or sadness, but in extreme vulnerability, that can be raw joy as well. Vulnerability is it's not sugarcoating it. It's being just truly authentic with where you are emotionally and spiritually. And the Psalms really capture that kind of the spectrum of vulnerability that the human experience has.
Yeah. And I think that's how God wants us to communicate too, and not be all fake about it, just to have that realness with him.
Yeah. It's when we give our lives to Christ, it's a personal relationship. And that's exactly what it feels like we're describing here.
Yeah, it is.
The realness of it.
Yeah. So you shared how there are different types of Psalms. For example, some focus on praise, some thanksgiving, and some lament. I like how you shared how praise is about orientation. Thanksgiving, new orientation, and lament was about disorientation. Can you give us more explanation about that?
Yeah, that orientation, disorientation thing is a Walter Brueggemann. He's an Old Testament scholar.
Yeah, I have a book by him.
And I thought it was such an interesting, because I usually see them broken down into categories of like praise, lament, or whatever. And Brueggemann's thing with where orientation would be the positive psalms, the praise, and like essentially that the world is working the way we expect it to. It's like, if you're a good person, good things come to you. If you trust in God, it'll be fine. But then there's this counter narrative where a third of the book of Psalms or something is things are not going according to plan. Life is falling apart. It feels like I'm drowning, and you're crying out to God, and God doesn't seem to be present. And so that's the disorientation category for Brueggemann. And then he talks about new orientation is like you've made it through that experience. So that's the Thanksgiving Psalms, where they tend to be like, I was in a bad place, I was in trouble, and you came through for me. So it's thankfulness again. But it might be like a little bit different type of relationship than the orientation one was, because you've been through more and it's maybe a little more realistic and seasoned. And I love that framework because we all sort of go through cycles where sometimes you're in one of those and sometimes you're in another. And so it's less like they're just these categories, and it's more like a sort of a circle you move through. And, at any given point you might be in this place, but then in the future you hope to, move back to the new orientation one or something.
Yeah.
It really follows kind of the story arc, where at the beginning of any narrative, you would have, the character who is about to go through trials and tribulations. And so they have Act 1 as far as life is good, but it's about to get really difficult. Then there's Act 2 as far as, the struggle and really trying to find the strength to continue on. And then you get to the conclusion of the narrative where there is this maturity, there's this growth and this strength. And in stories, the character would be able to look back and see that full arc.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
Will you share how the Psalms show that we have infinite value in the eyes of God? Many of these laments are thanking God at the end and reminding themselves that He turns our mourning into dancing, that we are part of a bigger story that God is part of. Why do you think our culture has not connected to this aspect of lamenting more?
Yeah, the lamenting thing is really interesting because it's losing track of that. Like, not having that as part of our worship life seems to be a really modern sort of American thing. And it's really common for us not to have that, but historically in other cultures, it was there. So a lot of writers and theologians and people have looked into, like, why are we so uncomfortable with that?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like part of it is just the sort of rugged American individualism, like needing to seem put together, needing to not open up about your vulnerabilities or something.
Yeah.
But the whole story of the Bible and like the story of the book of Psalms, where that thing about being a bigger story that we're part of and that God is a part of, I think where Psalms is really unique compared to some other books of the Bible is the view of humanity, that you talked about us having infinite value in the eyes of God. Psalms it's not that humans are broken and awful and we should feel terrible about ourselves theology, that so many people are handed this like total depravity or that sort of thing where we're awful and we can't do anything right without the intervention of Jesus and God is disgusted by us. And the Psalms don't seem to have that view at all. They love to talk about some of the best quotes in the whole Bible about human worth, where we're fearfully and wonderfully made. It says, we are a little lower than God, crowned with glory and honor. The psalm that's, what are we that you are mindful of us? But then it goes on to say that God is mindful of us and cares for us and we have dignity and worth. I think that's such a powerful corrective to that whole, like, we're sinful worms theology.
Yeah.
And so that's when I talk about connecting to a bigger story and the view the book of Psalms has of humanity, that's kind of what I'm thinking of.
And I kind of look at the cultural aspect of not addressing lament and not addressing that vulnerability as it's kind of a cousin to the rush of society these days, where things are supposed to happen quickly. The rush of society and kind of this urgency that a lot of Americans feel to move on quickly and to get back up on your feet and to go, go, go. And, if you really look at the emotions in life, there are no deadlines.
Right.
And so I think a lot of people put pressure on themselves to push past the emotions that they're feeling and not really, really experience the lament because they have this pressure of, like, I need to move on.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a completely made up deadline. There's no timeline to healing. So you have to sit with it and it happens on its own timeline.
Yeah, I totally agree with that because everyone grieves differently too. Like if you're talking about, like, my father just recently passed away and, just everyone has different ways of grieving. Some people, it does take a long, long time. And other times you just go through, I don't know, you feel like, I guess it depends on the dynamic of the relationship, but it's like you said, you can't ever put a timeline on that.
Yeah, that was weird because that's the second time I heard that since last night because I was at a Celebrate Recovery and they said healing is not a race.
Yeah.
It's not a race.
It's not a race and it's not linear. It's a cycle and you'll have longer cycles and sometimes they'll go really quickly, but that means that maybe the next year it might be a shorter cycle. So it's not linear.
Yeah. So I love how you share that the ancient Israelites knew God was okay with our raw honesty. You share how Psalm 13, which is a lament psalm, opens with a question. You called it parallelism. Do you want to expound on that?
Yeah, parallelism. I got deep into the weeds on how like Hebrew poetry is structured, researching all this, and then I used very little of it because it's not interesting to non-poets. But Parallelism is what Hebrew poetry uses instead of rhyme, basically. Like we're used to in English, poems typically rhyme or they have some kind of mechanism that makes the lines go together. And in Hebrew, it's parallelism, which is there will be two lines that look like they're saying the same thing, but typically they'll tweak the second one in some way so that it almost looks like it's saying the same thing as the first line, but it'll either make it more intense or it'll add a surprising element or something. And so you mentioned Psalm 13, that opens with, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" And that's, at first glance, those two sentences seem like they're asking the same question, but the first line is saying, "Will you forget me forever?" So it's like an accident. It's like God has forgotten to check in on me or something. And then the second line is, "How long will you hide your face from me?" which is worse. Like that's not forgetting. That's actively avoiding you.
Yeah. And it also, it gets more specific. So it's the "will you forget me forever" versus "will you hide your face from me?" Like that, the second line of "will you hide your face from me" becomes so much more of a painted image.
Yeah.
So that's, the parallelism, that's a mechanism for the way they'll structure these poems. But sometimes once you're looking for it, sometimes that second line hits you so much harder because you're like, oh, wow, they escalated it to such a vulnerable place.
Yeah. And I think we all feel that way at moments. I mean, it may be a short-lived moment, thank goodness, but just to have that expressed, I think it makes you feel normal. Like, oh, I'm not the only one that maybe feels that way sometimes, I think it's a real human way to feel.
Yeah, and the lament psalms are a third of like the book of Psalms. So this is clearly, it's not an outlier. Like it's completely okay in that faith world that the book of Psalms came out of. It's totally fine to hit God with a question like that.
Yeah.
And if that's the way that you're feeling, again, hopefully just right now, not in an ongoing manner. But
right.
If you're at your lowest and that's how you're feeling, you can absolutely just open up to God with a pretty intense accusation. And that seems to be fine. Like nobody banned these Psalms from the Bible for being too out there.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at Jesus's last days, he asks those questions to God as well. Like the human Jesus said, "Oh God, why have you forsaken me?" Yeah.
I don't know. It just made me think of this. I don't know if you guys ever saw the movie Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yeah.
Me and my sister, I don't know that was my first impression of Jesus. I mean, I think 7, 8, 9, I don't know, somewhere around that age. But I remember that scene and you can Google that scene and I showed all my kids that scene. There's a scene where Ted Neely, who plays Jesus, it's a 70s rock opera, but there's a scene where Ted Neely, who's playing Jesus, is in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's just wrestling with God, but it's the most beautiful scene to me. Even to this day, like it's timeless to me because it's so raw. It looks raw, but it's, I don't know, that just, even at a young age, that just had such an impression on me because I was like, wow, like, I don't know, to me, that drew me to God, seeing him wrestle that out a little bit, even if they dramatized it a little bit, I just remember that having a big impression on me as a kid.
Yeah. After I got out of my abusive marriage, I would tell people, I was mad at God for a couple years, but he wasn't mad at me. I could just feel his love. And people are like, would say, you can't be like that. And I think to myself, these Psalms are perfectly acceptable because God knows our heart and he already knows how we feel. Right. So it isn't like we're hiding something.
Right.
He already knows. So
I know.
Express it.
Right.
It makes
he
total
wants you
sense.
To express
right.
It. Then we don't want you to be fake and not, oh, no, everything's fine.
Yeah. Cause he already knows. So how do you heal if you don't even get in tune with your emotions? It's pretty hard.
Yeah.
Yeah. God, he wants our honesty. And, you mentioned your experience from being honest about like, no, I'm angry. He's not angry at me. Mm. When I was younger and I was going through kind of my own faith deconstruction, I remember talking to a friend about what it felt like and that I hadn't lost my faith, but I was sitting in a room with God and neither of us were talking to one another. And so it was kind of that idea of like, I'm still acknowledging that there is a God, but we're sitting together and we're not talking to each other. And honestly, that's okay. Like we're just going to be in the room together. And that kind of idea really comforted me during those deconstruction moments of just being like, it's okay. Like it's okay for God to see me this way because he made me this way.
Right. He knows everything about you, like the Psalm, that how we're fearfully and wonderfully made. He knows everything about us anyway. So
Yeah, because I mean, how was I supposed to be okay with, being married to a pastor that started a cult, started sleeping with one of the cult, so I had to come to grips with that, but
Yeah.
I wasn't happy about it.
Yeah.
And now I can see why I had to go through all that. I'm still not healed. I mean, I'm still healing. Stuff comes up every day, but I can see more now why I had to go through that.
yeah, and it makes
But then I couldn't.
well, and it makes me think, he was a pastor. So,
Yeah.
I feel like God would have that same reaction. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
He's not happy with that being he's misrepresenting him first
Yeah.
off. And I think God would totally understand where you're coming from in that.
Yeah. So, but everyone expected me to just be happy about it. Okay.
No.
Great. Everything's great. But anyway, so moving along in Psalm 15, the author was real about their anguish, but they stated they trusted God. They had what you call a turn to praise moment. They seemed to be a little at war with themselves, you say. And in some Psalms, there was no turn to praise moment. Comments such as, why do you hide your face from me? Which I think we can all relate to at one time or another. These are in the Bible for us to relate to. And anything else you wanted to add about that?
Yeah, the turn to praise, that's another kind of element of the Hebrew poetry. It seems like it was part of the structure. Like there's a way we expect stories to be structured. When you go see a Hollywood movie, it's got that 3-act structure, and it would be it's jarring if it departs from that. And it seems like the lament psalms were usually structured like it opens with an intense question, like, where are you, God? What are you doing? And then it lays out all this vulnerability, but then it does typically have this moment near the end where it turns and it's like, yet I will trust you. I know you're trustworthy. You're going to come through for me. And it ends in like a more hopeful place, which I've noticed a lot of modern worship music does that too. You mentioned earlier, a lot of modern worship music is just sugar coated and won't even go there, which is very true. But even the ones that do try to go there, I've noticed it's more okay, I think, for a CCM song to open with, I feel so lost. I don't know if you're here. Can you hear me? Whatever. As long as like by the third chorus, it's like, but I know you're here. It's going to be fine. Like if you end in a positive place, it's okay to go really dark in the beginning. But I am fascinated by the lament psalms that don't have that, because there are a few that don't do that. And so it just starts with darkness and then it unloads and then it just ends with that hanging out there and it never turns to praise. So those are some of my very favorite ones in the entire Bible, because it gives me permission. It tells me like we don't have to put the fake smiley face on at the end if that's not where we are. It's right. You can also just lay it out there and then just fall silent at the end.
Yeah, that it's okay. I like that. You talked about the concept of an upside down triangle. I love this quote you quoted from Walter Brueggemann. A community of faith that negates lament soon concludes that the hard issues of justice are improper questions to pose at the throne, because the throne seems to be only a place of praise. I like that quote. It really applies to our listeners, since so many of them have suffered greatly and their pain has been downplayed, and the question of justice is often overshadowed. Did you want to say more about that?
Yeah, we touched on it earlier. We were talking about the American church is kind of uncomfortable with lament. And American, pop Christian music is often a little uncomfortable with it. And I think we often, whether we're like directly told this or not, a lot of us have this feeling like we walk into church and we should be putting a positive face on. And, someone asks you how you are and you're like, good. Like it doesn't feel like it's okay to answer that question seriously.
Yeah, or honestly.
And that's something I've noticed about a lot of the big worship songs right now. Is like, we've been talking about it a lot, the worship band that I run, but how many of the big hits are these like confident anthems that are like, God never fails. No weapon formed against me will stand. Like, I know you're on my side. It's going to be fine. And that's nice. That's a nice, if that's where you are, that's a good mantra to have, I suppose. But like, not everybody feels that way. And I don't know how a song like that hits somebody who's really hurting.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's fine. It's good to have that optimistic perspective of it's going to be fine. But that doesn't mean that you shouldn't acknowledge the present.
Right. You can be honest. It's okay to be honest if you're in a really painful place.
I mean, there are weeks where I'm dragging myself to church.
Yeah.
And then people will be like, well, you're really late. And I'm like, hey, I'm here. I got here. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So
I was just going to say there's a world of difference too between having a stubborn hope that things are going to be okay, like that whole, God works all things toward good type of outlook, versus just naively being like nothing bad is ever going to happen to me.
Yeah.
Because I'm following the right beliefs and I'm in the right church. And so like no bad things could occur. And it's like, well, that's setting yourself up for pain.
Yeah, you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because there are things that come along that are not easy.
So you say some psalms you can feel the anger, such as in Psalm 3. They have been crushed by empires. They are hurting. You say God can handle the worst things we say to him. In a sense, you say they are entrusting God with their anger, asking God in a sense to take their hate and do justly. This is also very helpful for abuse victims. Did you want to read Psalm 3, Karen? No, I'm kidding.
Matt, go forth. Be angry.
Sure. Yeah, so Psalm 3. Lord, how many are my foes? How many rise up against me? Many are saying of me, God will not deliver him. But you, Lord, are a shield around me, my glory, the one who lifts my head high. I call out to the Lord, and he answers me from his holy mountain. I lie down and sleep. I wake again because the Lord sustains me. I will not fear though tens of thousands assail me on every side. Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw. Break the teeth of the wicked. From the Lord comes deliverance. May your blessing be on your people.
That's an intense psalm. But
Yeah. So did you want to share any more about that?
Yeah, Psalm 3 belongs to a type of psalms called the imprecatory psalms, which I was so going to try and avoid talking about when I started working on researching this series we did. And then the more I read about it, the more I was like, I think we have to talk about them.
yeah, I'm glad you did.
There are these psalms where it gets really real and it's like, hey, break the teeth of the wicked, destroy my enemies, smash people. And reading that can be really uncomfortable, like especially for us where we are now. It feels like a not okay thing to pray. And
Yeah.
I think if we're following the teachings of Jesus, it is technically not an okay thing to pray, but it's still in there, which is fascinating. So some insights I found as I was reading about, people who've studied this and tried to get to the bottom of like what's going on here. And part of it is just that uncensored, not feeling like you need to hold back with God. So it's like, if that's how you're feeling, apparently very violent and angry, you can offer that up. But the thing I found encouraging was this idea that you are offering that up to God. You're not acting on it. So, in a perfect world, we would never be full of rage and want people to suffer. But if you are in that place, if that's how you're feeling, it's a better thing to do with that feeling that to just turn to God and like drop it at God's feet and be like, this is how I feel, than to carry that out into your real life and start trying to make people hurt.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. That's a good example of what to do.
It is.
Yeah.
Instead of what not to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People
So
get crazy.
that insight helped me a lot with these because I'm like, it's not ideal to feel this way, but if you do feel this way and people do if you've been very badly hurt, that's a normal response. But to offer that to God and say like, look, this is what I want. I want to break some teeth, but but like I surrender this feeling to you. Hopefully you'll do the right thing with it, God, and it's coming from a place of justice, which helps because like the more you study the context these were written in, it's like this isn't about someone published a mean rumor about them or something. It's like these are people, their societies are at war, they're oppressed. And so it's an understandable anger sometimes because they're experiencing injustice and they are calling out to God to do something about it in a very uncensored way, apparently. But
yeah, but there is injustice in the world. I mean, I get really upset sometimes that, we all see things on the news that are unjust.
I hear a lot of anger from people I know, and this is a very good podcast. Hopefully they'll listen to it and, okay, this is what I'm going to do with this.
Yeah.
If they feel that way.
Yeah, you feel that way, but if you're able to channel it like in that way, it is a much better way to deal with it. I absolutely love how you shared how our pain can be transformed into art. And you mentioned the song Vapor, which is one of my favorite songs. And if you've not heard it, any of our listeners, you need to go look it up. It's by Michael Gungor, and they've got a new album out. I just had listened to a few songs from that. But you say that the work of an artist is an expression of hope. Did you want to expound on that idea?
Yeah.
To be continued. Stay tuned for next week's part 2. You don't want to miss it.
Thanks for tuning in to Hanging On to Hope. Check out our website, hangingontohope.org. There are resources on there, and if you would like to donate or volunteer, you can do that through our website. We are a brand new nonprofit, so we appreciate any and all support. And we thank you for listening, and until next time, keep hanging on to hope. We are evidence that there is hope and healing for you, and our passion is to help you find it too. So thanks for tuning in.
Thanks for listening, everyone.